So the McEachern Lecture Series is a great and inspired fit for tonight's guest, Linden MacIntyre, whom I have the honor to introduce to you now.
Thank you all very much. Looking around this room and I'm channeling Alan McEachern and I'm saying, what a waste of a room like this when I'm not running for anything. I donate them to Roger. It's great to be here, and I thank you, Dr. MacDonald, and I thank you, Lowell in particular, and Jim, and Young One, they've been looking after me very well here, and it's always a pleasure to come back to St. FX, but when you're being looked after, it's a very special honor. It brings back a lot of memories, and memory is a strange thing. I remember many years ago when I was a young reporter in Ottawa, out of boredom I decided to take on the task of writing personality profiles. Wasn't much done in those days. Of the 12 Nova Scotian members of Parliament, 9 of whom I believe were Tories, and 3 of whom, including Alan McEachern, were Liberals. So I was working my way through them, and I realized as I was going through them, you know, I'm being kind of flattering for most of these fellows. And it really came home to me just how flattering I was when I met Lowell on the Hill one day and he started to call me Boswell. So I remember Lowell fondly for that because I was flattered by that myself. And I was also honored by the fact that Lowell probably gave me my first drink of Chivas Regal Scotch out of the liquor cabinet of his employer, the late Senator Wallace McCutcheon, who never spent a lot of time in Ottawa, Wally McCutcheon. He was a tycoon from Bay Street who spent most of his time there, and so he let Lowell have the run of his centre block office, and Lowell had the run of his centre block bar. And I can recall getting the intricacies of Parliament Hill explained to me by Lowell Murray, fellow X-Man, as we sipped on Wally McCutcheon's Chivas Regal. My memory is funny. It rained in the morning of the day I came here for the first time. Eddie Fougere from Port Hawkesbury gave me a ride over. His son Al was starting here that day too. 2 other things I remember. I remember negotiating a traffic signal on Main Street. There was one traffic signal in Antigonish back in those days, and I was unaccustomed to traffic signals. And I can remember standing on the corner looking at this. Now, I knew what it was for. I knew the difference between red and green. But it was amazing to me that most of these highly educated university students and townspeople in Antigonish were colorblind. Because it didn't matter what color the light was, they just walked across the intersection anyway. I was shocked. The other memory is of the auditorium, this huge room down below the chapel. It's probably the biggest room I was ever in my life. I remember a lot of speeches being made that day. They called it orientation. And I remember someone explaining the university motto, which was prominently displayed on the stage, a big crest. And across the crest in fancy lettering was, "Quae cumque sunt vera." Never would have occurred to me that that was something we should now learn about in college, of all places, and understand and take on board and remember for the rest of our lives. Whatsoever things are true. A motherhood statement, if ever there was one. It wasn't even a complete sentence, but it sounded heavy like that, spelled out as it was in Latin. And I don't know if students today are required to think about it, but it was made quite clear then that we were supposed to take this on board. This wasn't just some slogan, it was a mission statement. And we should be guided all our lives by whatsoever things are true. I can't remember exactly, but I'm sure we were told the origins of this phrase. Paul to the Philippians, fill your minds with everything that is true, everything that is noble, everything that is good and pure. Everything that is true is synonymous with noble, good, and pure. So what else would we possibly fill our empty minds with? Of course, at the time, we could not have been aware of a real world out there in which there would be fierce and continuous debate about the meaning of words like truth and true. What's to go when you're 70? That's a lot to think about. That's too much to have to contemplate. It is for far too many people comforting to be told that warnings about the peril of political dishonesty, public apathy, and the specter of autocracy is fake news. Far too many normal people begin to accept that fake news must be blocked, ignored, suppressed, because fake news just means bad news, and we sure as hell don't need any more of that. I'm reminded of that old New Yorker cartoon. A group of dinosaurs are chatting, and one of them remarks, "Let me understand this. There's a giant comet heading straight for the planet, and we're facing extinction. And we have a brain that's just a little bit bigger than a pea." So the dinosaurs back then, like now, are like us. We're in one of those existentially decisive moments. The metaphorical comets are flying at us. The species is beset by widespread fear, political and cultural breakdown. Flight is the only sensible response. The search for sanctuary, the yearning for a stable and safe place where life can be improved. And luckily, our brains are big enough and our knowledge is sufficient to respond effectively, but we are paralyzed by our confusion. And the confusion is, for the most part, manufactured and political in nature. The confusion threatens the stability that has been established and sustained by constitutional commitments over centuries to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or the more prosaic Canadian objectives, peace, order, and good government. In many places, the confusion is already challenging our civilized commitment to historic values like empathy and generosity, liberty, and democracy itself. Among the perils we now face is the breakdown of democracy and the rise of leadership with souls encased in steel, driven by destructive ideologies. We Canadians are not yet as challenged as other people. Mass migration is not a problem here. We don't have a border with a refugee-producing country, not yet, at least. Maybe our neighbor to the south will become one. Stranger things have happened. So far, the demands on Canadian virtue have been relatively light compared to, say, Germany, Italy, France. I can only wonder how Canadians would react to the same challenges, and they will surely come. We can look forward to more stress as the world grows hotter and the seas rise, and as autocracy continues trying to elbow democracy aside, crushing civil rights and civic decency, and creating more migration. The strains are showing. We have a former Canadian Prime Minister who is loudly praising populism, joining the chorus of populist dissent that is stifling democracy in Hungary, Poland, and gaining ground in Italy and Germany, England, and the Netherlands. Is he a convert to the autocratic project, or has he been like that all along? We have provincial and federal politicians now trying out the same divisive tactics that are being used effectively in other places, in Europe, Latin America, the United States. As citizens, we can tolerate a lot of irresponsibility, corruption, self-serving behavior by people in positions of political authority. We can sleep at night because the system has built-in checks and balances to ultimately save us from the liars and the little autocrats. And we have the law. A nation has no morality except the law. The law is a collective moral declaration of what is tolerable. The law is needed for a society of individuals to function. The most important checks and balances against rampant abuse of power are embedded in our laws and embodied in the people who preside in the courts of law. But even the law is vulnerable to fear, to the disappointment of people for whom life feels empty, people who feel they've been cut out of their entitlements. But more than any other factor, the law, like all democratic institutions, is vulnerable to lies. These are the great liberties, the great threats to liberty: fear, disappointment, and lies. The causes of myopia that obscure the appreciation of what we have, exaggerating notions of what we think we should have. Fear, disappointment, and lies are poisonous in the absence of strong antiviral protection, a free and honest media, an academy with a commitment to the integrity of ideas and ideals, an uncorrupted judicial system. The death of liberty begins with cynicism, progresses to indifference, ends in impotence. And people who lose faith in democratic institutions lose faith in liberty. I think we forget how rare it is for freedom to be snatched away from a free people. The loss of freedom is, I believe, more commonly consensual. We eventually grow tired of disillusionment and confusion, and we finally consent to fantasies and false promises, and we consent to lies. There's no shortage of reminders in the history of the past century. Most Russians embraced their revolution. Germans elected their dictator. Italians celebrated the false promises of their Mussolini. The hopes of people in Central and Eastern Europe in the aftermath of a world war were defeated by lies, fear, and disappointment well before the communists took over. But confusion is a normal part of freedom. We can be confused by the choices we must make in a free society. We are living in a time of political pandemonium. The good news is that it is democratic political pandemonium. There will always be pandemonium. It's what democracy is all about. Multiple voices, many points of view articulated by a variety of temperaments. There should be pandemonium. It only becomes a problem when it is contrived to create fear and confusion by autocrats who understand that people are more easily manipulated and controlled when they are frightened and confused. So we must be on the lookout for motivation in political maneuvering. Watch for when the maneuvering becomes manipulation. Lies are the levers of manipulation. We must be on the lookout for them. We have the means to deal with them, and every 4 years or so, we have the opportunity. Hannah Arendt offers this warning: the surest long-term result of brainwashing is a peculiar kind of cynicism, an absolute refusal to believe in the truth of anything, no matter how well this truth may be established. The result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that the lies will now be accepted as truth and that the truth will be defamed as lies, but that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world and the category of truth versus falsehood is among the mental means to this end is being destroyed. However, she offers hope. Truth, though powerless and always defeated in a head-on clash with the powers that be, possesses a strength of its own. Whatever those in power may contrive, they are unable to discover or invent a viable substitute for it. Persuasion and violence can destroy truth, but they cannot replace it. I think she was telling us that we must stand fast for whatsoever things are true, and that we must stand fast for the survival of all that is noble, good, and true, because that's the key to our survival as a species. So let me end on a slight digression. A couple of years ago, I made a speech to a group of library supporters in Vancouver. It was November the 8th, 2016. I planned a speech that began with a story about the conversation with that congressman who made the case that his great country was idiot-proof. It was election day in the United States. I wasn't worried about the election because I was told by all the experts that Hillary would win. I was in a cab on my way to where the gathering was being held. The car radio was on. It was election day, and the results of the voting at that moment were coming in from Florida, and Trump was winning. Oh no. If he's winning in Florida, there goes my speech. Down the toilet. Never mind the future of the planet. The fickle Americans are ruining my speech. It was a friendly venue, patrons of this lovely local library. And I got there early. And I had a few glasses of wine. And I watched all these quiet, well-dressed people, my audience, studying their smartphones. And I said to myself, you don't have the confidence, you don't have the guts to assert that America is idiot-proof anymore. You've got to make a different speech. And so I did. I made a speech about my cat. You met my cat in the Maple Leaf Lounge in Montreal once. You might have forgotten, but it's a special cat. Yeah. But it was really a speech about a lot of things. The cat, of course, but about cancer and growing old and facing death, about fear and optimism, and about how a little cat discovered on a roadside in Cape Breton by my daughter, who was recovering from cancer at the time, figured into a lot of deep personal challenges in a very therapeutic way. And I ended up suggesting to this audience that sometimes the larger systemic threats that cause us to lose sleep turn out to be not so important after all. And sometimes it's a small discovery, a minor development in the course of an ordinary day or night that will make the greater difference in our lives. And I went even further. Who knows how public office, great public responsibility, an office with the responsibility like the presidency of the United States, can change the character of an occupant. Who knows? This new president, by January 20th, 2017, when he officially takes over, could deliver an inaugural address with such an inspiring impact. We would stand in awe for the next 4 years, maybe 8 years. All time, perhaps. And I reminded them of the great address by Franklin Roosevelt at one of his inaugurations in the middle of a depression, between the two worst wars in human history. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Well, January 20th, 2017, the inauguration of Donald John Trump came and went. The only message that I recall from that day was that his crowd was the biggest inauguration crowd in history. And that was a lie. There's a story told by a reporter who was there, and the story kind of captures that day and many of the days since then. The reporter recognized a voice as he was leaving the secure zone where all the important people had been sitting. 2 men were chatting as they walked along, and one of them was George W. Bush. The reporter did what reporters do. He moved up a little bit. And Bush made a comment to his friend about that speech, Trump's inaugural address. A comment that for George W. Bush I find to have been quite remarkable for its insight and depth and prescience. "Man," said George W., "man, that was a lot of weird shit." As a storyteller myself, I had to ask the question, as I always do, was that a true story? I read a version of it in the New Yorker, but is that definitive? It can't be true because it almost humanizes George W. Bush. But I believed it. Not because I knew it to be true, which it probably was, but because it made me laugh. And in an age defined by delusion and deception and borderline despair, that might be all that we can do. Thank you.